clicking on this video. My name is Carolyn. This channel is all about true crime, mystery, and anything abnormal. Highly recommend subscribing because this channel is definitely a vibe. I have an extremely interesting case for you today. Today, we're going to be talking about the first serial killer in America to be convicted using DNA evidence, as well as the first person to ever be exonerated for murder in the United States using DNA evidence. So let's get right into it. On the morning of September 19th, 1987, in Richmond, Virginia, a South Side neighborhood, everyone was waking up. Some people were out jogging. It was a beautiful day. There were people going to farmers markets and people were planning to have outdoor barbecues. Obviously, the kids were all playing outside, having a great day. It was just a really beautiful day out. But all of this peace would be disturbed by a 911 call to Richmond police. The night before, around 1 a.m., a man by the name of Arnold Ellis had gotten home late after a night out. And when he got home, he noticed that there was a car parked in front of his house. He didn't think much of it. He went inside and went to bed. When Arnold got up the next morning, he noticed the vehicle was still parked outside in front of his house, and he found it a little bit strange. So he thought, I'm going to just go out and see what's going on. And when he got close to the car, he realized that the car was running. There was no one inside the vehicle, and he just found it a little bit strange. So he called the police to report the vehicle. When police arrived, they discovered that the vehicle belonged to a woman by the name of Debbie Davis, who was 35 years old. And interestingly, she only lived a block away from where the car was parked. Police went to Debbie's apartment. They were knocking on the door. They were not getting a response. And her landlord actually noticed the police coming up, knocking on Debbie's door. And the police explained, that they had found her car and they just were checking. They wanted to make sure that Debbie was okay. So the landlord let them into Debbie's apartment. When police entered Debbie's bedroom, it was clear that Debbie was deceased. She was laying face down. She was partially naked, and she was tied in a very peculiar way. She had a rope that was tied around her neck. Her two hands were bound behind her back, and then there was a rope connecting the rope around her neck to her wrist behind her back. During the autopsy, it was determined that Debbie had been essayed in every way possible, and she had also endured prolonged torture. It's believed that the killer had spent many hours with her, basically choking her unconscious, letting her become conscious again, continuing to strangle her over and over, as well as being essayed over and over as well. It was very easy for police to determine how the killer had gotten into Debbie's apartment. The kitchen window the screen of the kitchen window had been cut, and obviously the killer had climbed in the kitchen window. One thing police noticed was that the killer was very careful, and they noticed that he had wiped up certain areas, and he was very careful not to leave either fingerprints or footprints inside of the apartment. Now, this killer is doing this because he thinks that's the only way that he's going to get caught for this crime. Police could tell that this was not a first-time crime, that this criminal had experience and had gone to great lengths to try to cover their tracks. 2 weeks after Debbie's murder, less than a mile away, a man by the name of Marcel Slag got home very late from work one evening. When he came home, he heard a noise upstairs and he assumed that he had awoken his wife. His wife's name was Dr. Susan Hellems, and when he heard the noise upstairs, he thought, oh, I've woken up my wife, and he didn't, go upstairs to investigate or anything. He just assumed, I woke up my wife when I got home, and he went and he got in the shower. He took a quick shower, and when he was done, he went to the bedroom, and again, he walked in to an absolutely horrific scene. He saw the naked deceased body of his wife, Susan, laying halfway in the closet and outside the closet. Marcel very quickly called 911 and came to the very disturbing realization that the noises that he had heard when he got home were most likely the noises of the last moments of Susan's life with her killer. Susan had been tied with rope around her neck and her hands tied behind her back in the same way that Debbie Davis had been tied up when she was murdered. So very quickly, police determined that these two murders must be connected. And also, they happened less than a mile away. The killer also had gotten into Susan's home the same way he had gotten into Davis's home. He had cut a screen, and police determined, based on how he was entering the homes, he must be in very good physical shape. This was somebody who had a lot of strength and physical ability. And the crime scene where Susan was murdered, very similar to Debbie's crime scene, there was very, very little evidence left. Now, one thing that was left was semen. And this is something that at the time, criminals would not have been aware that DNA can be extracted from their semen. At this time, anyone committing a crime, the things that they know police are looking for that can be tied to them are fingerprints, blood, and footprints. Those are the main ways, other than obviously investigation and all of those other things. But for actual evidence being left, those are the things at that time that if you're trying to get away with a crime, those are the things you're very concerned with. So the killer was very careful to not leave any of that evidence, but he had no idea leaving your semen would contain your DNA. One really disturbing thing, I found it really disturbing, that was found at Susan's crime scene was on the windowsill where the killer had entered and exited the home, which he had cut the screen, same as what had happened, how he had entered Debbie Davis's home. He had left a used container of Vaseline. So police quickly determined that not only was he SAing these women, he was also self-pleasuring himself as well. When the autopsy was done on Susan's body, it was determined she was killed in the same manner as Debbie had been, where she had been choked and strangled and then released, and then it was done over and over and over, torturing her, and as well as being assayed throughout this process. Police didn't have a lot to go on at this point, so what they decided to do was to see if they could find any connection between the two women, to see if somehow that could lead them to the killer. And they found that connection quite quickly, and it was at the local Cloverfield Mall. Debbie Davis, the first victim, she worked at a bookstore inside the mall, and through receipts, the police were able to determine that Dr. Helm had bought a book directly from Debbie Davis. From this, police determined that maybe the killer was choosing his victims from the mall. So they start surveilling the mall. But this is a big shopping mall, right? So you have to think about, like, a mall, there's thousands and thousands of people going in and out of this mall every day. So police, they're surveilling outside, watching, they're inside, trying to, see if they see anything suspicious. But it's really just, it was leading them nowhere. They did believe that this is where the killer was getting his victims or choosing his victims. Diane Cho was a 15-year-old high school student. She had recently immigrated from South Korea to America, and only 5 months earlier, her and her family had moved there. She had picked up the English language extremely quickly, so she was very helpful and an intricate part in her family to be sort of a translator to help her parents with all aspects of their life. And she was just an absolutely wonderful, beautiful young woman. About 2 weeks prior to Diane's murder, she had mentioned to her friends that while she was at the mall, she noticed this creepy guy kind of following her and watching her. Although Diane had told her friends about this creepy guy she had noticed at the mall, she never described him physically in any way to her friends. So it wasn't as though there was a creepy guy following her and she had told her friends what he had looked like. All she had mentioned was that he was just this creepy guy. Saturday night, Diane had gone to bed just like normal any other night. She, all the family had said goodnight to each other. They'd gone to their respective rooms and everyone went to sleep. The Sunday morning, the parents get up, and when they get up, they let the kids sleep in. So at home is Diane and her brother. The parents are like, okay, let's let them sleep in. They're going to go out and get some chores and running around that they needed to get done. And they were going to then come home to get the kids and make sure they were ready. And they were all going to attend church Sunday afternoon. When Diane's parents got home, they got home around 2 p.m. And when they entered the home, Diane's brother Roman was awake and the parents were like, "Where's Diane?" And he said, "Oh, she's still in her room. She hasn't gotten up yet. I thought maybe she wanted to sleep late, and so I didn't want to disturb her." Her parents found it a little bit strange considering it was 2 p.m. and it wasn't typical that Diane would sleep that late in the day. When Diane's parents entered her bedroom, it was horrific. Diane was lying partially naked with a rope tied very tightly around her neck, and she was very clearly deceased. Roman, the brother, was the one to call 911 because he was the one who could speak English the best. When he called 911, they recommended that he try CPR, and he just very quietly said, "It's too late, she's dead." When the police arrived at the scene, it was all too familiar. She was tied very similarly with the same ligatures as the other 2 victims. She as well had been essayed and had gone through prolonged torture. Only 5 days later, and 100 miles north in Arlington, Virginia, 45-year-old Susan Tucker was at home alone. Her husband, Reggie, he was on a business trip in Wales. While Reggie had been away, he had been calling and speaking with Susan daily while he had been gone. But the last couple of days, he had been calling and she wasn't answering, and he was starting to get a little bit concerned. A neighbor of Susan's also was getting concerned. He had noticed that Susan's bedroom window had been open for the last couple of days. And we're in November, so it was cold. So he found it very strange that she would have her bedroom window open for days at a time. So he went over to the house. He just wanted to check and make sure she was okay. He knew that her husband was out of town, so he just thought, you know what, I'm just gonna go over and just make sure everything is okay. He got to the door and the door was kind of ajar. But before he even got near the door, he could smell an absolutely horrific, disgusting smell. And he knew it was not a good sign. He went home and called 911 immediately. When police arrived, as they were getting close to the front door that was ajar, police could smell the absolutely horrific smell, but police knew what that smell was. Police knew that that was the smell of a decomposing body. Police enter the home and they do discover Susan's deceased body. She was naked and bound the same way the other victims had been tied, and it was clear that she had been deceased for several days at this point, and she had endured the same type of torture and essay as the other women had. And this is where Detective Horace comes on the scene, and he becomes the hero. He noticed that the way that Susan had been killed was very similar to the 3 murders that had happened 100 miles away. Another thing that he notices is that this is very similar to another murder that had happened years earlier. In January 1984, a woman by the name of Carolyn Hamm had been murdered, and the ligatures were almost identical to the Susan's murder and the 3 other murders that had happened. The only problem is Carolyn's murderer was already in prison. Not only had Carolyn's killer been caught and was in prison, her killer had also confessed. So after Carolyn's murder, 2 people had come forward to say that they had noticed a man by the name of David Vasquez hanging around Carolyn's house, and they found him very suspicious. So police at the time had brought David Vasquez in for questioning. Now, David Vasquez had some learning delays. He had a very low IQ of only 70. And after a 14-hour interrogation, he confessed to the murder. And David Vasquez was sentenced to 35 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 5.5 years. So he is currently in prison at the time that these new murders are taking place. Detective Juarez was convinced that all of these murders had to have been committed by the same person. So what he does is he sends the DNA from the semen that's found at all the scenes. He sends that all off to New York to have DNA testing. So Detective Juarez, he's trying to think of criminals that he has known throughout his career. Because one thing he knows is that before these murders were committed, whoever was committing it had experience at being a criminal. And most serial killers, obviously, they usually have arson, break-ins, R-wording. Like, it's usually they've committed a lot of smaller crimes leading up to it. And as he's thinking about it, one particular man comes to his mind. And when he's thinking of it, all he can think of is he remembers his name was Timmy, and he was having a hard time remembering what this man's name was. He had interacted with him while he was a juvenile, and he had committed break-and-enters and, you know, kind of those types of smaller, non-violent crimes. And eventually he realizes his name, and it was Timothy Spencer. So he decides he's going to go through Timothy's criminal record. And what he discovers is very interesting. A couple weeks after Carolyn's murder, which was the murder that had happened years before the murders that are currently taking place, Timothy had been sentenced to prison. And he had been in prison for 4 years. It had nothing to do with any murders. But he had been released and put in a halfway house 2 weeks prior to Debbie Davis's murder. So Carolyn was murdered. A couple weeks later, he goes to prison, completely unrelated. 2 weeks after he's released, Debbie Davis, who is the first murder in these new murders that are taking place, and he was released not far away from where Debbie Davis lived. So then he wants to talk to David Vasquez, the man who is in prison serving for the murder of Carolyn. When he goes in to talk to him, he talks to him and he can tell within a couple of minutes this man knew absolutely nothing about Carolyn's murder. He didn't know any detail. He didn't know the slightest detail of absolutely anything that had happened. So he was convinced that he had been wrongfully imprisoned for Carolyn's murder. So what's going to bring the whole thing together? DNA, baby. So all of the DNA is sent off to New York to have the DNA testing done, but it's going to take a little while. So while this is all happening, Detective Juarez decides that they need to be monitoring Timothy Spencer. And one thing they noticed very quickly was Timothy Spencer spent a lot of time at the Cloverfield Mall. He didn't ever seem to really buy anything or, get anything to eat, go to a movie. He didn't really seem to do anything there, but he did spend a lot of time there. Only once before this had DNA ever been used to convict someone of murder. A year prior, a baker in the UK had been convicted of killing 2 girls using DNA evidence. But that all changed with this case because the DNA came back and the DNA proved that Timothy Spencer was the murderer, and the odds were 1 in 705 million. So, and he was a match to all 5 of the murders. On July 11th, 1988, Timothy Spencer was sentenced to death. And a year later, David Vasquez, after spending 5 years in prison, was finally exonerated using DNA evidence. On April 27th, 1994, Timothy Spencer was put to death. Bye, bitch. And that's the end of today's story. I want to say a huge thank you to all of you who reached out to me after my last uploaded video. You guys have no idea how much your love and support means to me. I've had so many amazing conversations with so many of you on Instagram, just talking about you having similar experiences to me, and really bonded with so many of you, and I appreciate so many of you. And just know that you can follow me on Instagram if you just want to see what I'm up to. Also, if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm a great listener, and especially if you deal with similar issues that I deal with, all the love and support I get from you, I want to give it all back to you as well. So feel free to contact me anytime if there's anything you want to talk about. Also, any case suggestions, you can leave case suggestions in the comment section of any video, or you can send them to me on Instagram. Either place, it's good. Right now, I'm planning the next 2 months of content. So if there is cases that you are interested in, this video would be a great video to leave those suggestions in, because I'm planning out the next 2 months of my videos. So it'll kind of probably get a good chance of getting on the list if you ask for it. So I hope you all are having an amazing day. Do something today that makes your soul happy, and I will see you in the next one.